Welcome everyone. My name's Andrew Thompson. I'm the General Manager of CFMG Capital, and I welcome you to another another one of our Q&A sessions. For those that you have been to quite a few of them, welcome back. For those that are new to the Q&A sessions, it is a very informal affair. We'd like to welcome various guests. Today we've got Bernard, but we've guests across the industry. We welcome property experts, demographers, tax experts, investment experts, superannuation experts. And the goal of the event is to provide a value add to our investors, not to sit up here and tell you all about our great offers that are coming up, but more just give you some insights into the investment process, give you some insights in what's going on in the world, give you some insights into tax advantages you can enjoy from our expert accountants. And probably one of the more popular ones other than Bernard has been Clive, our self-managed super fund expert. I know when I was sitting there listening to him talk, I was vigorously taking notes to let my parents know in their late 60s all the different tricks and tips they're missing out on. So it is all about adding value, but I won't keep you too long. We've got a couple of hundred guests joining us online, so if you do ask questions, Bernard or myself will repeat the question, and the reason for that is so the people at home can hear. We may have a few guests joining us throughout the evening because I know there's a bit of traffic around, so there are a few gaps in the audience right now, but I won't go into a huge introduction. I think we all know who Bernard is. He's a nationally and world-renowned demographer and is a great presenter, so we welcome Bernard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for that introduction. Thank you also to CFMG for the invitation to speak. My presentation today, even though it looks like a religious title, Faith in Melbourne and Belief in Brisbane. Sometimes I think you need faith in Melbourne these days, but I'm going to tell you why. I think that Melbourne is a city that you can't hold down forever. Melbourne will recover. And as for Brisbane, the lead up to the Olympics is a nationally significant demographic event. I have been looking at demographics for Australia for effectively 40 years, and I certainly noted the demographic impact that Sydney had from about the mid-1990s, and I'll go through that argument as I go through my presentation. I want to start by taking a big picture perspective and ask, is Australia a good place to invest? Should you be confident in the future of Australia? And this is especially true, I think, for young people in the room. I want to show you a chart that I think shows why you should have faith in Australia. It's a chart that is based on data released by the UN Population Division last October. It's a view of the number of people on planet Earth over 200 years, from 1900 on the left through to 2024. It's about 8 billion people on the planet. The interesting thing that was released last October is the view of the balance of the 21st century, and it shows there is a concept called peak humanity. The peak number of human beings on the planet ever is likely to occur in about 2075, something like 50 years into the future. So 10 billion people in 50 years, 8 billion today. That's a 25% increase in the population. To me, that means there has got to be a 25% increase in food, energy, resources, commodities, space security, lifestyle. Which countries on the planet deliver food, energy, resources, commodities, space security? That's us. We have what the rest of the world will increasingly want over the next 50 years. Our major cities should prosper. Australians should prosper over the next 50 years or so. This is why you would invest in Australia, and particularly around the issue of population growth, and particularly around our capital cities as the gateway for immigrants into Australia, in fact. The next data set I want to show was again released last October. This is released every October. This is produced by the IMF, and it shows the richest countries on earth. And it shows the GDP per capita for 195 countries. Here is the top 21, and your eye will already have gone to number 11. This is for calendar 2024. It's expressed in US dollars, and it shows the richest countries on earth. Australia ranks at number 11 out of 195 countries, in fact. And the important thing here, I think, is that if you look at number 10 and number 12, you could reduce or increase our GDP per capita by 10%, and we'd only move one notch. So with the rise and fall, concern about cost of living, we're not doing as well as we did, yeah, but we're still in the top dozen countries on earth in GDP per capita. The other thing to note is that there's only one country richer than us with a population equal to or bigger than us, and that's America. Number one is Luxembourg, 600,000 people. It's a bit like Canberra in Europe, and it services the EU and NATO, so it's full of public servants. Then, of course, you have Switzerland, 10 million people, it's actually 8. Ireland, about 5 million people, which has just transformed itself in the last decade by reducing corporate tax, of course. Then Norway, 5 million people, Singapore, 5 million people. In fact, that is Iceland, about 600,000 people or so. 27 million people with a high GDP per capita is quite an achievement. We have a very high standard of living in Australia, and I think we express that through our housing. If you look at the same data set from the IMF 30 years ago, in 1994, as opposed to 2024, we did not rank at number 11. We ranked at number 20. Someone has put a rocket under Australia over the last 30 years, and that rocket, I think, is globalisation. Rightly or wrongly, selling gas, coal, iron ore, agribusiness product to China has catapulted us forward. Now, I get it that the GDP per capita is an average, and it means that the wealth is not evenly distributed. I get that. That applies to every other country on earth as well. We have improved relatively. You think, oh, where has all of the money gone? Where have we spent our extraordinary wealth over the last 30 years? I think we spend it on housing, quality of life, lifestyle. Superannuation was at 1993, 1992, something like that. Travel is important to the Australians, but this is so important, you should be seeing evidence of this in every city, town and suburb in Australia, and I think you do. The average house in Australia is better than the average house in every one of those countries. 195 countries is my point. And I think it's part of our culture. You have to look at Darryl Kerrigan and the castle. It's as relevant today as it was in 1997, in fact. And even you can go back to parodies like Edna Everage. It was all around about housing and our quality of life. It's very important to the Australians. It's our core value, in fact. Let's have a look at this, another high altitude view of Australia. I love big maps like this, like getting up high and looking down on the Australian continent and seeing what it says about the Australian people and their values. Here is a map that shows areas of population growth in blue and population loss in red between 2025 and 2035. This is the next 10 years. And over the next 10 years, we're going to add 4 million people, 3 million from overseas, 1 million locally. 3 million will come through our capital cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, bit in Perth, bit in Adelaide. And you think, oh, it's all very interesting. What does it say? Because I think the Australian people are talking to us through this map. They're telling us about their priorities and values. When I look at this, I see that Australians are obsessed with lifestyle, up the coast, down the coast, sea change, tree change. Everything west of the Great Divide through to the West Australian border is contracting. We are not building towns in the interior as we once did. What we are doing is flying in, flying out. Why would we do that? Because we're obsessed with lifestyle. We want the mineral wealth and the prosperity, but we don't want to live there, is the point. And so I think this shows an obsession with lifestyle, up the coast, down the coast. You know, from Perth to Adelaide, it's a common value. Common value focused on lifestyle, and a common value, the obsession with housing, is my point. I want to show you now the most valuable businesses in Australia today. This is based on the ASX, and this is the 10 most valuable corporations in Australia today. And the ones in bold are headquartered in Melbourne. In fact, I'll do the top 20. So the ones in bold are headquartered in Melbourne, and my point here is that, yes, Melbourne might be going through a tough time, but it actually has institutional corporate depth. If BHP was listed on the New York Stock Exchange, it would rank at number 86. Number 1 is Microsoft, then Apple, in fact. But the world's biggest mining company is based in Melbourne, Australia. And the reason why we have the world's biggest mining company is because we control the resources of an entire continent. We have built corporate assets around our strength. And so BHP, and you could probably add Rio Tinto, which is technically based in London these days as well, 2 banks, CSL, Commonwealth Serum Laboratories out at the zoo, Parkville, a global pharmaceutical business founded in 1916, in fact, and manufacturing COVID vaccines today. At Telstra, of course, you could add institutions like Australia Post. In fact, at the Federation, Sydney got the Reserve Bank and Melbourne was given Australia Post. Out of Australia Post came Telstra. You can see what drives the corporate strength of Melbourne. Yes, you can have tough times, but it is corporate assets that drive prosperity. Very interestingly, there's probably only one in the top 20 that is based in Brisbane. The rest is predominantly Sydney or Perth. In fact, the one being, which one is it? It's not, I thought it was QBE, but that's actually in Sydney, in fact. The point is that corporate assets drive prosperity, ultimately drive prosperity in Australia. You can't be in the business of demographics and not have cool acronyms like yuppies and dinks, and I have spent a career inventing these acronyms, more for my own amusement than anything else. Here are some of those acronyms that I've enjoyed creating or popularising. First one of the pumpkins, PUMCINS, and I suspect there might be a few pumpkins here in the audience today, stands for the professional urban middle class in nice suburbs. You can tell if we come from a pumpkin household if there's goat's cheese in the fridge. Melbourne has a goat's cheese curtain. It's about 5 kilometres out from the CBD, either inside or outside the goat's cheese curtain. Hipsters live inside the goat's cheese curtain, and it's slowly moving. I think it's sort of at the Northcote Hill on the north side. Sydney and Brisbane also have similar, as does even Perth, and I would say Auckland as well, in fact. Then, of course, you have the phenomenon of adult kids living at home with mum and dad. These kids are known as kippers, K-I-P-P-E-R-S, kids in parents' pockets, eroding retirement savings. I have had kippers. They come and go, and they leave their stuff in the family home. Yes, kippers. And then I wanted something, I live in Melbourne, and I wanted something to describe the phenomenon of Melburnians in particular, of fleeing the capital city, fleeing Melbourne beyond the Ring of Steel during the pandemic. I called those people leaving Melbourne at that time the Vespers, V-E-S-P-A, virus escapees seeking provincial Australia. They've been scootering out of our capital cities, and I think many have actually remained in those regional areas. And then, of course, everyone knows some Lombards, Lombards, lots of money, but a real dickhead. This idea of standing up at an altitude and looking down on Australia and looking down at how things have changed is a concept that goes through my columns almost every week, in fact. I love that idea, looking through time. If you were to go back to the 1954 census, when Bob Menzies was the Prime Minister, 9 million people in Australia. Here are the top 20 cities. In 1954, Kalgoorlie was number 20. Ipswich was considered to be a separate city to Brisbane at that time, and the Blue Mountains was considered to be a separate city to Sydney. Melbourne and Sydney, of course, the biggest cities, and I've bolded all those in Victoria and in Queensland at that time. When I look at this list, I see a colonial outpost of Britain. Number 10 is, I think it's number 10 is Launceston. Sort of wool and wheat, a bit of gold, has driven those. Ballarat. At Federation, that is 1901, Ballarat was the same size as Perth, in fact, driven by gold, Melbourne gold. Just fast forward 70 years through to today, and here is how we have changed. Here is Australia at 2025. So we have, it rounds up these days to 28 million people, and Melbourne and Sydney at 5.4, 5.6 million people. It's only 200,000 difference, and Melbourne will actually close that gap over the next 10 years, in fact. And if you look at this, number 6, the Gold Coast did not exist in 1954. No one had heard of any place called the Gold Coast. No need for a Gold Coast because the idea, you more than likely died in the workplace in your mid-60s at that time. So no need for a Gold Coast or a Sunshine Coast or a Cairns or Coffs Harbour or Port Macquarie or the Surf Coast or Victor Harbour or Mandurah as examples. Lifestyle, the pursuit of lifestyle, it being important to the Australians is the point. So Melbourne and Sydney, around about 5 million people or so. Brisbane at not quite 3. You bolt on the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast and Toowoomba, you've got about 4 million people in southeast Queensland these days, which will host the Olympics. And if you just fast forward to 2035, what are the 20 biggest cities in Australia in 10 years' time? In order to come up with this analysis, I've had to look at about 40 cities and make my own assessment in places. Here is my view of Australia at 2035, and it gives a sense of which places will grow the most. And the point is that there's growth everywhere. I mean, if you have a country of 28 million people, add 4 million to it over the next 10 years, then every part of Australia can be expected, certainly on the coast and the lifestyle cities, will grow. And you can see that Melbourne will probably, on these figures, overtake Sydney as the largest city on the Australian continent, probably about 2036 at the moment. And the reason why I think Melbourne will overtake Sydney is very simple. This actually started after the Olympics, the 2000 Olympics, and it comes down to quality of life and lifestyle. Affordability, housing affordability, particularly for immigrants, in fact. Very interesting, you see Mackay coming in at number 20. It just pips out, it knocks out Launceston. Launceston's still growing, but not as fast. It's Mackay, and number 21 is actually Busselton in the west, Busselton and Bunbury. And both of those sit between a coal reserve, the Bowen Basin, and the market for energy overseas. So it's energy and resources that drive cities going forward, and their capitals is my point. So we have about 28 million people on the Australian continent. About a third were born outside the Australian continent, immigrants, 1/3. That proportion for America is not anywhere near a third. In America, it's about 17%. In the UK, it's about 15%. In Germany, it's 14%. We have 1/3 of our population born outside Australia. And you think, well, I think that drives aspiration, particularly aspiration to home ownership. If you come from Europe or China or wherever it is to Australia, you have a point to prove. You want vindication of your decision to come here. And you saw it first with the Greeks, the Italians. Mum and dad would work 1 job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and it was the duty of the son or daughter to succeed and make them proud. My son, the doctor, my daughter, the lawyer. Look at my house. Look at my lifestyle. Look at my quality of life. It's very important to 1/3 of the Australian population, and that has an impact, I think, on Australian values. It also has an impact on our food culture. Here is the kind of food that I grew up on in country Victoria back in the 1960s. That is white bread, processed white bread. We didn't know there was any other kind of bread. So it was meat and 3 veg back in the 1960s. I have a photograph of my 7th birthday in the late 1960s where I'm having a party with my sister and a couple of neighbourhood kids on a travel rug under the clothesline, the rotary hoe in the back lawn. And my mother had made fairy bread, which was white processed bread with full fat butter, sprinkled with, we called it hundreds and thousands, or sprinkles, which is pure sugar. And that was washed down with a Tarax soft drink. And that was a great delicacy at that time. My point is that food and that birthday party could have occurred in the East End of London. We had not changed our palate and our cultural reference points for 200 years. And it was evident in a small country town on the other side of the planet. By the 1970s, it started to transform. The Greeks and the Italians, the Mediterranean influences. When the Greeks and the Italians arrived, it was out with tea, in with coffee, in with arugula, in with olive oil. We even started to kiss each other on the cheek. We saw that as sophisticated. You're colonial people, a little bit needy, and looking for evidence of sophistication to add to our quality of life, add to our home life, in fact. The first time I heard of pizza was Toto's Pizza in Carlton, about 1976, and the first time I'd heard the word lasagna was 1980. Didn't quite know how to pronounce lasagna, and cappuccino was pronounced cappuccino at that time. Of course, all sorts of other coffees have emerged in Melbourne. The 1980s brought new migrant influences, Asian influences. We had the Vietnamese boat arrivals in the late 1970s, 5 years after the end of the war. That green stuff at the top is bok choy. I live in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. Our local Safeway at the time in Camberwell closed for 2 weeks to complete renovations. When I went back into it, this is in 1998, when I went back into the store, into that Woolworths store, I saw an entire bay in the fruit and vegetable department given over to bok choy. Bok choy, I've watched that bay change over the years. Bok choy has now been joined by pak choy, choy sum. There's a whole family of choys. We have mainstreamed-ised immigrant palate influences, and we are very, very engaged by this. Now, it's welcome to Australia, mate, what have you got to eat? And it's a bit like decorations to our quality of life. Bok choy, cappuccino, kissing each other on the cheeks. Very sophisticated, and we're a very absorbent culture, is my point. This century, of course, we have the influence of Middle Eastern influences. That stuff at the top left is quinoa. I don't think quinoa is Middle Eastern, but I remember when it was popular about 2008, 2009, Australians didn't know how to pronounce it. As soon as we learned how to pronounce it, it was, oh yes, we'll have the quinoa salad. Thank you very much. My point is, when you get about a third of the population coming from overseas, it would make our palate very exploratory. We're always looking for new influences. And I will show you how it impacted the design of our homes as well a little later on. Here is the next 10 years in Australia. It's probably the most, I published this in the Australian. If you have a business, this is really, really important. Every 5 years after the census, the Australian Bureau of Statistics demographers, the best demographers in Australia, do a future view, a 50-year view into the future by single year of age. This is a 10-year view cut from that database, 2025 to 2035, 3.5 to 4 million people added, and it shows the net change by single year of age. What this is saying is there's more Australians in every year of age up to 100, birth on the left, 100 on the right. There's more Australians in every year of the life cycle going forward. But it is lumpy. There is a bucket load of 20-somethings coming. Cafes, bars, restaurants, apartmentia, an apartment, student accommodation in Carlton. You cannot pump that number of people into our major cities primarily and not have an impact on 20-something culture and 20-something accommodation unless they do something very different to every other 20-something in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane that has been saying, I kind of get that. The major shift here is the one in the middle. These are the millennials. And the peak in 10 years' time is age 47. They're in this room today, but they're 37. So 37 to 47 is peak millennial over the next decade. In your late 30s, I think that Australians go through a gateway in their late 30s. By your late 30s, you're partnered up. You have 1 or 2 or 3 kids. Your partner goes back into the workforce, and all of a sudden, that inner city minimalist chic apartment in St Kilda or Bondi just doesn't do it for you anymore. You need 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a front garden, a backyard, and a Zoom room. Where are you going to get that? 6 million millennials having that sort of single and couple inner city hipster movement, eating smashed avocado apparently, drives culture, drives demand. What happens when they move into their 40s? I want my forever home. And I want space. That is out on the edge, not necessarily, maybe middle, towards the edge, and even just beyond the edge into the lifestyle zone, the tree change and the sea change towns in Australia. And you would say, well, the peak time of earning most income in any year of the life cycle, 0 to 100, what year do you earn most income according to the census? That is 43. 6 million millennials, late 30s, passing through 43 in the next 10 years in a lifestyle capital city zone must have an impact on the demand for space, suburban homes and space. Not apartmentia, but suburbia is my argument. Unless they behave completely differently to every previous generation of Australians. And I say, the minute you can live that apartment life as a single, you can do it as a couple, you can even do it as a couple with a baby. The minute you have a toddler, the minute you have Lego, I'm sorry, you flip in terms of what you want. I can't do this anymore. I need space. And that space is certainly on the edge of cities like Melbourne, certainly on the edge of cities like Brisbane, and you could go around Australia. In fact, you can see the Generation X probably downshifting at the moment. People call them the sandwich generation at the moment. They're dealing with 80-something parents and 20-something kids. And then the baby boomers pushing. The oldest baby boomer today is aged 79. So in 10 years' time, they'll be 89. The time when you really need care, not everyone, but you're in the zone, is sort of mid-80s. So we'll see an explosion in care over the next decade or so. And you think, well, what is this? Is this good? Is it bad? Is this what happens in every country? I want to show you the same concept for Japan. 2025, 2035, Japan is a country of 125 million people. Here is Japan, same concept. Where would you rather be? Where would you rather be in business? What's a better proposition? In fact, show me a better demography on the planet. You know, maybe a Luxembourg, 600. No, I want like 27, 28 million people that have values like that, and then wash over it. A third of the population needs to be aspirational immigrants to give that cosmopolitan, aspirational, European-esque lifestyle. In fact, where else would you rather be? So let's have a look at Melbourne. Melbourne's taking a fair beating. Pick up the papers at any time. I can remember this in the early 1990s. So I've lived in Melbourne all this time and certainly watched with great interest. You look at the big businesses of Melbourne. If you just stand back for a moment, like Visy, for example, and Linfox, logistics, actually family businesses. Tech, new tech, it's not an Apple, it's not a Google, but, Seek and REA Group, culture, the National Gallery of Victoria. The National Gallery of the State of Victoria, only the Victorians, only a self-confident Melbourne culture could say, we are a state, we're going to call this the National Gallery of Victoria, in fact, and project it to the rest of the world. This is the confidence that gold gives a city 150 years ago, in fact. And even culture, like Kath and Kim and Edna Everidge and Kenny and Daryl Kerrigan, name the equivalents in any other city. Melbourne Leeds culture, you would say. This is not something that's going to disappear. That is woven in to our DNA. In fact, big manufacturing, of course, including COVID manufacturing, the super funds, the industry super funds are based in Melbourne. Sport, of course, retail like Coles and Bunnings and others, and bold thinking, like the Monash Heart Centre. And there's an app that was developed in Flinders Lane called Hot Doc. You don't ring your doctor to make an appointment. You actually go through an app. These developed in Melbourne's just, came out of entrepreneurial, creative Melbourne, in fact. Here is Melbourne versus Sydney in terms of its population growth since 1994. So Sydney is in blue and Melbourne is in orange. Sydney had the Olympics in the year 2000. So just step through with me. Sydney is pulling away from Melbourne. Every year, more people are going to Sydney. In 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000, then flips. And it has flipped every year since then, because Melbourne offers something that Sydney cannot or will not offer. That is affordable housing on the edge of Melbourne. 6 million millennials passing through 43 with 2 or 3 kids, passing over the St Kilda apartment to the next generation of 20-somethings is my point. Melbourne added 2 years ago 150,000 people in a single 12-month period. I've actually looked at that in comparison to American cities. The only Western car-based cities that added more than Melbourne in that year was Atlanta in the US. In fact, it's extraordinary levels of growth, which pump up the demand for housing. You can buy a house and land package in somewhere like Mount Atkinson on the western suburbs of Melbourne with a 5 in front of it. Might only be 300 square metre block, but it's 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, front yard, backyard, entry level. Try doing that in Sydney. Melbourne delivers what Sydney cannot or will not, and it's because of its geology. It's got a broad, flat plain in every direction. It's a strategic advantage. My point is that Melbourne will come back as a consequence of these natural attributes and strategic strengths. Here are the 50 biggest cities on the Australian continent, arranged from Sydney on the left at 5.6 million people to Alice Springs with 35,000 people on the right. The size of the bars show the percentage change in the population over the last 10 years. It shows the demand for housing. And there's one that sticks out. It's Warragul-Druin, 50,000 people, growing at 4% per year for 10 years, just beyond the edge of the metropolitan area. It's a tradie town. Go to Warragul-Druin on a Monday morning at 7 o'clock, stand on the Princes Highway, and you'll have a caravan of, or a load of, Ford Ranger utes, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, heading back into Cranbourne, Pakenham and Berwick to work on housing estates, in fact. And you could do that around Bacchus Marsh or Gisborne as an example of that. Fastest growing town in Australia. And you can see Melbourne and Brisbane up there growing at well above the Australian average, as you would expect. This is over 10 years. It's not a one-off. It's like a 10-year concentration. In fact, you need strategic depth in order to grow at that. It just happened by fluke. Something is driving that, in fact. So Ballarat and Geelong and Melbourne, and Geelong's very interesting because, you know, that's sort of overspill from Melbourne. The estate down there is Armstrong Creek. Ballarat is also, you know, growth tipping into Ballarat, tipping into Warragul-Druin, in fact. Here's some maps that I published in The Australian 18 months ago. You often hear of politicians talking about Middle Australia. When I first heard that, I thought, I can measure Middle Australia. If you take every suburban district that comprises the Australian continent and calculate the average income and then rank them, highest average income to lowest, so Turak's up the top, Double Bay and wherever's down the bottom, what's in the middle? So if you take the 20% above 50% and 20% below 50%, that's 30% to 70%. Here's what you get for Melbourne. The green bits is Middle Australia. It's where Middle Australia lives. The blue bits are the top 30% of households on average. And the yellow bits, effectively often social welfare, battler areas, if you like. And I have blown up the centre of it, and I've put circles around two areas that I really like. Around Carnegie, you can see two green bits surrounded by blue bits. If ever there was a place that was due for gentrification, it is Carnegie and Glen Huntly Ormond. That will disappear, it'll be snapped up by gentrification. And on the top left is the area around Essendon. I think, you know, all the growth in Melbourne's north and west creates business opportunities. Do you really want to create a business in the north and west and live in Toorak, South Yarra? No. You need an equivalent of a Toorak and South Yarra on the western side of Melbourne, and I think it's emerging in the top left. Very interestingly, you can see that yellow bit at the top on the left. That is Coolaroo. That's where Darryl Kerrigan lives. And Neighbours. Neighbours was filmed in Pinot Crescent in South Vermont, right in the green bit. And Kath and Kim, of course, Fountain Lakes, which was filmed at Patterson Lakes, but it was meant to represent Fountain Lakes, which is Middle Australia, in fact. Here are the growth areas of Melbourne. The pink bit is a 2-hour drive time to the Melbourne GPO, and you can see the configuration of the Melbourne metropolitan area. And you see Warragul-Druin off to the right. You know, it's actually the Baw Baw Shire, so it's actually bigger than the actual metropolitan area, in fact. But let's see, you know, all of these, so you've got the big metropolitan area, and then you've got these lifestyle towns like Ballarat and Gisborne and Bacchus Marsh and Bendigo, and smaller ones, in fact. So you'd say this actually fits the model absolutely perfectly. So the millennial generation looking for their family home, their forever home, on the edge of town. You can do the same exercise for Brisbane. Here is southeast Queensland, Brisbane. So Brisbane with about 2.8, 2.9 million people. Sunny Coast, about 400,000. The Gold Coast, maybe 800,000 or so. And out to Toowoomba in the west. And the very interesting thing about Brisbane's social structure is that Middle Australia actually gets access to the coast. If you did this for Sydney, you know, the eastern suburbs all around the harbour, it's all blue, higher income. You can still get access to the coast in Brisbane. It's got a lot of space to catch up to. Forgotten city in many respects compared to Melbourne and Sydney, but I think we'll see that close the gap on the way to the Olympics over the next 7 years or so. And that's what the circles represent, the fact that you can get access to the beach as a Middle Australia person. That will leverage up over time, is my argument. And here is the lifestyle towns beyond the 2-hour drive time. So you can get to Brisbane in 2 hours, but you know, up the coast, down the coast, a lot of options in southeast Queensland for lifestyle, which is really the Australian dream in many respects. Let's see where the wealth is being created. I want to show you the fastest growing jobs on the Australian continent over the last 6 years. From May 2019, so 6 months prior to the pandemic, through to May 2025, so 6 years, the fastest growing job on the Australian continent is aged and disabled carer, and we added 200,000 jobs in 6 years. In fact, that job has doubled over that time frame. Sales assistants, of course, registered nurses and electricians. You know, the whole tradie movement, this idea of tradie towns on the edge of metropolitan areas, I think is really quite important. Here is the top contracting jobs. What jobs have evaporated in Australia over that time frame? Checkout operators, evaporating because you do your own checkout these days. Of course, office managers because there's fewer people in the offices. Forklift drivers because it's all being automated, in fact. And crop farmers, one farmer buying out the neighbour, in fact. And then, of course, you have the phenomenon of work from home, which I think, again, works the argument of millennials moving to the edges of cities and telecommuting effectively. Here is the proportion of the workforce working from home over previous censuses, from 1996 through to 2016, so whatever that is, 20 years, 5 censuses, it's about 5% of the workforce has always worked from home. And if you look at the kind of people who are working from home, it would be jobs like journalist or author, CEOs were working from home, midweek in winter when the census was held. Here is the 2021 census. It's 21%. In Melbourne, it was 29%. In Sydney, it was 39%. I mean, big cities, you would work from home if you could. And you think, oh, now that the pandemic's over, that'll just go back to normal. I don't think it will. I think it will go back to maybe 15%. 15% is 10% above the long-term average. 10% of the workforce is 1.5 million workers who will now think, no, I don't have to commute every day. I can go to Warragul-Druin or a Gisborne or a Ballarat or a Geelong and commute into town because I want affordability, I want quality of life, I want lifestyle, and I want space. 6 million people now moving into that space. If my prediction of 15%, we can actually measure that against the 2026 census when the results are released in 2027. And if my prediction of 15% is correct, you will never hear the end of it. If I am wrong, we will never speak of this prediction ever again. But I'm pretty sure that if you look at core Australian values, it works for Australians to not have to commute. You can spend more buying your home if you're only going to commute once a week, once a month, for example. You spend more on your home. And that brings me to the configuration of the Australian home. Here's the kind of house that I grew up in the 1960s, very much modelled on my childhood home. It was a Victorian Housing Commission home in Tirang. So it's a quarter-acre block, so it's 1,000 square metres, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, mum and dad, 6 kids in our household, so bunk beds, the whole shebang. And if you wanted to visit this house, our house, you go up the pathway onto the porch, then you turn right into the lounge room. The lounge room was a modern incarnation of the parlour. The parlour was the good room. The good room was where you entertained guests and suitors. Suitors never got near a bedroom back in the night. Very different today, I can tell you. And off to the side is a mahogany side stand with a silver tea service. And the point of that is to showcase the wealth, the prosperity and the values of the people that ran that household. Compare that with how we live today, with how I think Middle Australia lives today. That is 60 years later, a globalisation, COVID, the wealthification of Australia. Here's what we have done with the quarter-acre block. It's not to scale, but this is, in fact, 4 bedrooms, not 3, 2 bathrooms, not 1, 2 income earners, not 1, and it's 2 kids, not 4, let alone 6 kids. If you wanted to visit this home, you wouldn't be taken to a good room at the front of the house. Now, we've put the good room at the back of the house because we want to drag you right through the house to showcase our wealth and prosperity. So for the first time in history, guests now pass the open doors to the bedrooms, which means the bedrooms must now be glimpse perfect. And this has led to the pillowification of the bedroom over the last 20 years. Not 2 pillows, not 4 pillows, but 6 pillows, plus a little square cushion that is set to diamond effect exactly in the middle. I don't know what happens if you square up that diamond. No male has ever been game to touch that cushion. Of course, men can never get the pillow architecture right. You grab the big square pillows by the ears. They're called European pillows. You grab them by the ears, you fluff them up, you drop them into position, then you karate chop in the middle to give it that perfect V. This is as important to us today as was the silver tea service a generation ago. Then you take your guests and you mill around an island bench, which means that the island bench must move up market. It's now marble, Italian marble in waterfall style. Rising out of the centre of it will be a silver German gooseneck tap. Tapware is now the new silverware, in fact. The back veranda has been given a makeover. In fact, it goes by the very Mediterranean, sophisticated Italian name of al fresco. In fact, I think when the Greeks, the Italians arrived in Melbourne or Brisbane back in the 1960s, and they looked at that house on the left, they would have whispered to each other, what the hell are those Australians doing living in an English house? They have a Mediterranean climate. They should have indoor, outdoor living. You're right. The most plastic, pliable, rich, aspirational, home-obsessed people on the planet sit out with tea, in with coffee, in with arugula, in with olive oil, we'll kiss each other on the cheek, and we will change our homes to reflect indoor, outdoor living. We're always cherry-picking to adorn and embellish our quality of life, to make it more sophisticated, to give us a better quality of life. And the alfresco space just is a better fit than the back veranda. That's 200 years old on the left. That is modern Australia. It's modern Mediterranean, aspirational, 11th richest nation on the planet, Australia. Do you think that millennials are going to raise their kids in an apartment in Bondi or St Kilda? No. They will want space in middle and outer suburbia and just beyond the edge of the metropolitan area because they work in the professions and they can zoom it in. When you put it all together, you say, well, it's a pretty compelling argument for that kind of product on the edges of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide. In fact, top left is water tanks down the blind side of the house, installed during the Millennium Drought 16 years ago. filled to the brim, never been used, but give us a sense of safety and security. I think we'll see EV batteries, lithium batteries, beside the garage in due course. I think I could find that house, certainly on the edge of Melbourne. I think I could find it in Caboolture, in Penrith in Sydney. I think I could go to the suburbs of Bunbury or Busselton and find that house. In fact, I might just... That must mean that there is a common capacity and a common view about how Australians want to live across Australia. And I think that is true. There must be enablers of this house in every one of those locations. Bed, Bath and Table, Barbecue Galore, Bunnings, Harvey Norman. We've built businesses and we've built a business model around that product. And that product, I say, is what the next generation will want. Work from home, study from home, Netflix from home, telehealth from home, care from home. I think that this is the forever home that the next generation will want in middle and outer suburbia. And just some key points. I'm actually very happy for my slides to be made available in a PDF format to people who were in the room or online. And I might end it there, take a drink of water, and then take some Q&A. Thank you very much. Any thoughts, any observations about my argument for the rise of the forever home on the edge of Melbourne, Sydney? Yes. Call it out and I'll repeat it.
Do you think that there'll be some sort of concept of fast rail that might take people to more provincial places and still allow them to have access to cities?
Will there be fast rail to more provincial places, I suppose, beyond Ballarat and Geelong? Well, I suppose in due course. And there is a high-speed rail that is being contemplated at the moment, being investigated. But I think it's, these things take many years to put in situ. It might be something that could configure Australia around the middle of the century. But my worldview and my experience with business is, when you're talking to corporates, CEOs and corporates, I'll talk about the next 5 years. It's my stewardship and into the next stewardship. So the next 5 years, 10 years at tops, I don't think fast rail, truly high-speed rail, is going to change the configuration over that time frame. At the end of the day, if I look at common values that apply to Australians, from the suburban Darryl Kerrigan house of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the one that I grew up in, through to today, the common denominator is lifestyle, quality of life. That suburban home of Darryl Kerrigan was a better proposition than an East London tenement. And that house that I just showed you is a better model for a family living than was the model on the left, is the point. And the big shift that I think has come about is the idea of working from home. It was never seriously considered until the pandemic, and business thinks, oh, I'll just mandate everyone to come back to work. The people least likely to come back to work are Australians, in my view, because of our values, our obsession with quality of life and lifestyle, and the fact that we will configure our housing to be more remote from where our workplaces are headquartered. I mean, millennials, I can deliver my workplace value anywhere. No, not all millennials. Now, if you're a nurse or a doctor or something like that, you have to go to the place. But if you actually look at the people who were working from home, it was accountants, engineers, management consultants, lawyers, people who actually were the laptop people. That's enough to actually drive what I think is going to be a surge in demand for these middle and outer suburban forever homes. Yes, call it out.
With the future forever home, coupled and working from home, coupled with our reluctance to
Well, the question is, where is the energy going to come from to support the forever home? I think where is the energy going to come from to support any kind of accommodation? So it might require more energy than maybe an apartment in the city, although you could argue the toss on that. I did point out the batteries, the solar batteries next to the garage. So I think solar panels become far more popular. But I think there is a big debate to be had around that, around 2030. Probably at the end of the day, we will see where Australians' true values lie at some point in the future, where they are forced to make a choice between a forever home and notionally saving the planet. So hopefully you can read between the lines there. Very good. I'll ask at the back and then I'll come back to you. Yes, call it out. Yep. I think your point about suburban sprawl extending out, consuming valuable farming land, I think that's very legitimate. If you think about this, a 25% increase in population globally, we need to be producing and exporting 25% more food, so we do need to protect our food growing areas. Nevertheless, the old model of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, of extending out and then commuting back into the city centre, I think that's a 20th century model of city organisation. The 21st century, I think, is around regional hubs. So we'll extend Melbourne out to the north and to the west and to the southwest, southeast, perhaps through Warragul Druin as an example. And in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, I think people will orientate towards their local area rather than live in a Warragul and commute all the way into Collins Street, or live in a Wollert and commute all the way into Collins Street. So that was the cultural shift that took effect during the pandemic. We released the idea of working from home, and if, by my measure, 10% of the workforce, 1.5 million workers, no longer have to commute every day, then that's a lot of people remaining in the family home longer and reducing the impact of commuting. I am concerned about using valuable food growing land, particularly around Werribee in Melbourne, which is great for vegetables and so forth. But I think with good planning, we can direct the urban areas into areas that are less valuable, perhaps, for food growing. I know it's uppermost in the minds of strategic planners when they do consider rezoning applications, the preservation of food production areas on the edges of our city. So it is a legitimate concern, but I think it can be managed. And I think it delivers a better quality of life. Living on the edges of a metropolitan area and coming into the city once a month, maybe, physically coming to the city once a month, actually offers a good quality of life. You get access to all the services, health and education, without the drudgery and the mental health strain of fighting away through traffic in and out. I just don't see the millennial generation doing what the baby boomers did, which is commuting from Cranbourne and Pakenham into the city centre and back out again. Now, when you think about it, when there is an alternative, why would you do it to yourself for a 30 to 40 year working life? It takes years off your life. Destruction of habitat for our native animals, that's true, and in fact, as you do extend Melbourne out, then you do consume habitat. Hopefully that again can be managed by fencing off or protecting particularly delicate habitat. Again, I know the strategic planning community is very, very sensitive to those issues, and there's huge debates around, what constitutes a valuable habitat or what constitutes a valuable food production area. There is an entire industry of consultants battling it out on that. So it just doesn't happen willy-nilly, which I think is the basis of your concern, that we might just bulldoze out. Well, we might create new places, but we're very selective about where they go, in fact. There was one here.
I think my question builds on a couple of those others. You said the population or the millennials want to move out. But you've got that climate change energy need, you've got the environmental impacts that has. And then you've got Victorian government, as a lot of other state governments, financially strapped. And they try to increase density.
Yep. Well, this is my demographic worldview is not the. So this is how can we afford to actually build all the infrastructure on the edge of town when the politicians and strategic planners are trying to build up apartments around transportation centres. That's the argument. I get the logic behind that. Let's create apartments around train stations, because then we don't have to provide new hospitals and new schools. We can do it all very efficiently. You're sweating the assets is the point. The problem is that the core values of family-based Australians, late 30s through to the early 50s, where you're raising kids and teenagers, is not necessarily aligned with that kind of living. Australians generally, if given a choice, in my view, will want a front yard, a backyard, and at-grade space. So I think there is, again, like the question here around energy, there is a very hard debate to be had. There's one that makes perfect economic sense, get that? And there's another line which is, here is what Australians fundamentally want, and especially if they have 2 or 3 kids. My argument, my bet is with core Australian values, wanting a family home, a forever home, in the style of Darryl Kerrigan, but in a modern sense, which is very energy intensive and is at odds with what strategic planners want. And I can feel a fight brewing for that, but I can go back 100 years. I wrote my master's thesis on Melbourne in the 1880s. I can go back 100 plus years. Australians, Melburnians in particular, we invented the quarter-acre block. We invented neighbours and projected that reflection of our culture to Britain. They lapped it up for 50 years. We're not going to give it up, is my argument. We might like to think we will. I don't think we will. Not entirely. Yes? Yeah. Is there any statistic on the number of people who will downsize over the next 20 years or so? I've never seen that question. I don't know that you can actually get it from the census either. You can see where people have changed location, where they've come from and where they've gone to, but often people downsize in the local area. They'll sell their rambling house in Camberwell and buy an apartment or a townhouse nearby to retain connectivity. I've never seen a data set that actually measures that, but we have 5 million and shrinking baby boomers, aged probably about 63 to 79 at the moment, and they are peak downsizers. They will be forced to downsize over the next 10 years as they have health issues, serious health issues, and I think we will see much more of it over the next decade or so. But I've never seen that figure measured. Was there a question at the back? One closing question. Elio, yes. Well, the learnings from the Sydney Olympics, as I said, I showed that chart of Melbourne and Sydney. Sydney went gangbusters in the 1990s, absolutely gangbusters. And from a demographic perspective, I could see the shift in interstate movements from Victoria to New South Wales, Queensland to New South Wales, South Australia to New South Wales, Auckland to New South Wales. It was almost like Sydney sucked in labour, competing for jobs and competing for housing in Sydney in the late 1990s, sent everything through the roof. And at the end of the Olympics, all those workers went home and Sydney went through a malaise. You might remember it at the time. And that's when Melbourne stepped up and offered what Sydney could not or would not offer, affordable housing. And that's been its strategic strength ever since. So again, I say that the time, if you think, if Brisbane has its Olympics, the glory years are the 5, 6, 7 years leading up to the Olympics. Just don't get locked in beyond the Olympics, is what the evidence from Sydney is suggesting. Get in, 7 years, and literally the next year, 2001, 2033, there was a flip. Now that might have been just Sydney. I don't think so. I think the fact is that you do draw in specialist workers who come in, engineers and God knows whatever else, say, I'll have that house, thank you very much. They can compete up the value of housing. And they get out, they go home. I am joining everyone for dinner, so thank you very much and chat later. Thank you.
It's more not so much the downsizing, particularly in Sydney though, it's the inefficient housing. And what that is what a typical empty nester. So most empty nesters live in a 4, 5 bedroom home. And so there's basically 3 or 4 bedrooms unused for 20 years for those empty nesters. And those families, before the work from home boom, those families living in the outer suburbs were driving past empty homes or commuting past empty homes. So I'm not sure there's a policy that can fix that, but I think that shift was happening before the COVID thing. As someone that's been involved in developing or selling property for 25 years, just leading up to probably in the 5 years pre-pandemic, for the first 15 years of my career, every housing estate or anything we ever did in the outer suburbs, the number one marketing tool was how far away from the CBD it was. Leading up into the pandemic and the period before the pandemic, that was no longer a selling point. It wasn't the first bullet point, it might have been the last bullet point because cities were becoming decentralised. The non-office worker or the non-CBD worker was certainly now, they were working, living and doing their entertainment and all their sporting, recreation, all that was in their local suburb. And now with people working from home, that's only coming on stronger. But yeah, we can debate all this over dinner. So there's a few people here tonight that didn't register. There's no problem with that, that's fine. But when we go upstairs, there were names on tables and things like that. So if you weren't registered, don't worry, Millie will help you find a seat and we'll make our way upstairs for dinner. Thank you.